Have you ever heard of the lost Suikoden game? A game so obscure even Konami doesn't remember it and never mentions it? It's a companion game to Suikoden Tierkreis called Stardust Castle, and it only came out in Japan and, well, it doesn't exist. Kind of. Stardust Castle is supposedly a visual novel that was released shortly before Tierkreis itself, and provides some insight into the world, setting, and the events that led up to the main game. It was only available in Japan on Konami's cell phone service Konami Net DX and is so obscure that there's very little information about it or its story available online. At least one synopsis has been found that was written by someone who had played it, but actual screenshots of the later chapters are few and far between, and forget about actually playing any of the chapters. The service is long dead, and it seems not many people cared enough to buy the whole story, or at least they didn't care to share online. These days, it mostly only gets mentioned as a trick trivia question when asking, how many games are there in the Suikoden series? Where most people will be able to list the main series, tactics, Suikoden, and card stories, but even the most hardcore fans would probably not even know about Stardust Castle. And if you follow Konami on social media or read news stories about Suikoden, you may see mentions of how there are 11 games in the series, but if you include Stardust Castle, there should be 12, so not even Konami lists it. While it's certainly not a stretch of the imagination to think that the Western side of Konami isn't even aware of an obscure Japanese-only title, considering their poor track record of not being able to remember their own characters' names or using Google Translate to relay information from the Japanese side, not even Konami of Japan mentions Stardust Castle on the Suikoden portal site. This is because while Stardust Castle certainly does exist, it's not actually a game. At least not according to Konami. Taking a look at various websites that are still available from around the time of Stardust Castle's announcement, a particular term keeps appearing. Novel, or phone novel. They don't call it a game or even a visual novel, and in order to avoid any confusion, they point out that it is not a novelization of the Tierkreis game, but an original story using the setting. Not an original game, but story. Visual novels have always inhabited the "is it though" corner of the game room due to the limited playability of them, and while visual novels will vary in complexity, the player usually has some agency over the events, and isn't just reading along, but is able to change events through choices in the game. For example, in the first chapter of Suikoden, the player can choose how Nash will treat Sierra, which will affect her behavior towards him, and alter how many luck points he has. Luck points being a type of currency that can be used to choose some locked choices and set the story on a different path. While not exactly riveting gameplay, there is at least something for the player to do, and though the story will always take Nash to the same place in the end, regardless of the choices made, there will be differences in how he got there. In Stardust Castle, however, the player has no agency at all. All you get to do is turn the page. That's because it's a novel. It has the same amount of gameplay as a Kindle book. An ambitious novel, with sound effects, animations, and characters on screen, but a novel still. It's kind of like a motion comic, and like I showed, it's not just me saying that it's a novel, it's Konami saying it. All the press releases and news stories that I've been able to find about Stardust Castle only ever refer to it as a novel, or sometimes more specifically, a phone novel. And this seems to be how the few people that have talked about it in Japan also refer to it, as a novel that you read. Now, I would be remiss not to mention that there is a subgenre of visual novels known as kinetic novels, like Nekopara, that also have no choices beyond clicking to the next text box but still count as visual novels, at least according to their creators. I might not entirely agree with that, but that's just me, and we can probably discuss for hours on end exactly when and how a visual novel becomes a game without really reaching any conclusion. But the important thing is that Konami doesn't seem to think that Stardust Castle is one, and rather they seem to view it as something more akin to the Suikoden short stories books or various manga and novelizations they've made. But game or not, Stardust Castle is certainly lost. You can't buy it anymore, and it's never been made available anywhere beyond the original Konami Net DX release, and Konami doesn't seem keen on talking about it at all. Though, in fairness, They don't seem to like to talk about Konami NetDX much at all, considering Suikoden 1 and 2 were also ported to the service, and they never mention that either despite the PSP version of 1 and 2 getting its own spot on the portal site for some reason. And while I personally did not care much for Tierkreis, others did, and I do think Konami should make Stardust Castle available in some way. They could even put it on their official website. After all, it's not like they'd be losing money on making it available in web form since they're not actually selling it. Though that is assuming that they haven't actually lost the files for it in the past 15 years. And if you're wondering what the 11 games actually are, it's these. Suikoden 1 through 5 plus Tactics, and Tierkreis are the 7 that got released in English, while Japan also got Suikoden Volume 1 and 2, card stories for the Game Boy Advance, and the unrelated side game The Woven Web of Centuries for the PlayStation Portable. Hopefully this has helped clear up what Stardust Castle actually is and why it doesn't get included when Konami lists the games in the series. But if you're interested in learning more about the actual story in this novel, then Colgan Valya's channel has a good summary on it with some more screenshots, and I'll link it in the description below.